All right, comparing the effectiveness of executive function training combined with CBT versus standalone CBT on quality of life and adult ADHD. No, really rolls off the tongue. So ADHD, let's start with that concept. Obviously, it's not just being fidgety and distractible. Well, it's not part of it. ADHD is actually characterized by symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsiveness, and inattentiveness. I won't go into all the symptoms, but I will go into the functional consequences. So there is typically poor occupational performance, attainment, attendance, and higher probability of unemployment. There's elevated interpersonal conflict, and typically behaviors related to symptoms are often interpreted by others as laziness, irresponsibility, and failure to cooperate. So, you know, it can be this, but it is also very much this. So for adults with ADHD, they're typically not considered as much in literature because it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So kids are going to be, considered more. Um, and that also means treatment literature is also geared more towards the youngins. So that is something to consider. Nonetheless, ADHD can last into adulthood and does, has a prevalence rate of 2.5%. So should be considered more. Because you may be a kid and have ADHD and you'll be considered, people will see you and be like, hey, he's not really got his head in the game. But then once you become an adolescent, you're like, maybe he's just easily frustrated and, can't do things. But then you get older and it's just like, wow, yeah, he just never really shaped up. And then eventually you're just some guy with weird knees and a bowler hat. Although maybe that's more specific to goop. Point is, it can affect you across the lifespan. Executive functions are defined as higher-level cognitive processes of planning, decision-making, problem-solving, action sequencing, task assignment, and organization, effortful and persistent goal pursuit, and inhibition of competing impulses, flexibility in goal selection, and goal conflict resolution. God damn. So that's from the APA, the psychological one, not the psychiatric one. So that's essentially them in a nutshell. Sorry, I'm reading so fast. The 10-minute time limit. So Tony Stark overriding Jarvis and Iron Man is what I think is a good example of an executive function. He's the prefrontal cortex where the executive function takes place. Jarvis is the rest of the brain that's automated everything. And then Tony overriding him is the executive function itself. So, picture this. Made me laugh when I made it. I don't know. Forward. All right, executive functions. They're a topic of little consensus. However, there are 4 domains commonly agreed upon and explored: inhibitory control, also called impulse control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and planning. So basically, as executive function is a large component of cognitive health, as well as a role played in other domains of health, it may not be surprising that poor executive function is predictive of worse outcomes in general functioning and quality of life. Poor executive function has also been proposed as a transdiagnostic factor of liability to general psychopathology. All that means is, poor executive function is related to, having a mental disorder. Very simply put. Core ADHD symptoms are often discussed alongside executive functions and executive function deficits across the literature. So much so that actually a validation study of an ADHD assessment tool used an executive function assessment tool to demonstrate comparability. I thought that was neat, not that relevant. Maybe a little relevant. So the relationship of ADHD and impairments in executive function is well established, very well established, but it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship, but it is there. Their origins and the cause of that relationship is still not agreed upon. But as ADHD is defined by struggles with attention and impulsivity, this relationship is typically not a surprise. Here are some findings from the articles I used in my literature review in my research proposal. So it was found that both symptoms and associated problems with ADHD correlated with lower executive function and greater functional impairments. Executive function deficits, affective symptoms, and all quality of life domains, save for social, demonstrated a significant correlation within adult ADHD. Lower quality of life and greater impairment was explained by both executive function deficits and adult ADHD symptom alike in terms of variance, and then furthermore in variance, low executive function was able to account for most variance in quality of life outside of ADHD group membership alone, which means they were the 2 biggest contributing factors to quality of life impairment, or at least explaining for the most variance. So implications of what we just talked about are the following. ADHD and executive function deficits have unique impacts on function and quality of life, And that implies that those with ADHD and lower executive function may predictably report worse quality of life in comparison to those with ADHD and normal executive function. Because again, not a one-to-one relationship. You can have ADHD and have normal executive function, same vice versa. So this potential effect of executive function on quality of life within the ADHD population may impact a large portion of this population, given the common coinciding of ADHD and executive function deficits. So implication 1, implication 2. So essentially what all that means is presence of adult ADHD coupled with low executive function, which is not unlikely, as we've established, is, for lack of a better term, not stonks. Not at all. So what now? What interventions are currently being used? How is this being treated? Well, cognitive behavioral therapies, CBTs, have been used to treat ADHD, and they've demonstrated effectiveness. This includes standard CBT, ACT, DBT, mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. Literature reviews do call for more randomized controlled trials, though, so keep that in mind. So anyways, regarding the effects of CBT on executive function specifically, it should be noted that CBT does not explicitly target executive function. However, the goals and interventions used across CBT are often related to executive functions. For example, developing strategies and skills to manage unhelpful impulses, new planning strategies, all that kind of stuff, all that great stuff. So that may help improve executive functions within ADHD. As far as executive function interventions go, most commonly used one outside of coaching, which we won't do because we're using counseling, is computerized cognitive training. Basically, it's an intervention more specifically designed for executive function deficits. They often take the form of a virtual game or task. This review right here looked at the use of those in school-age children with ADHD. They found decreases in executive function deficits and ADHD symptomology, but only in 11 of the studies, so half the studies, and only 9 of those studies conducted follow-ups, and 7 of those maintained symptom reduction. So how much can we actually attribute that to the CBT? It's hard to say, but basically findings are mixed. When we look at adults and children, it's found to be very limited in its ability to lead to any improvements, if any improvements at all, honestly. General functioning and ADHD symptoms are also not improved. There is just no real strong transfer to real world executive functioning. They usually just get better at the games or tasks in the CCT, so the transfer isn't strong. Working memory does seem to improve, though. It seems to be the only real domain that has good transfer effects. So, what this study hopes to address, then, considering everything we just talked about, is that CCT as a standalone intervention appears to be limited, but it's also not been combined with intervention with a high transfer effect, such as CBT. So, therefore, it's not been tested in the context of a comprehensive approach. So, what this study hopes to do and aims to address is assessing the effectiveness of a combined approach of CBT and executive function training via CCT. A lot of acronyms here. I'm so sorry. Hopefully the slides do the lifting. So, maybe we get stonks. Maybe. So, how do we do it? Well, I'm going to keep this part brief. Basically, the study will compare AAQOL and Brief A outcomes. This is an adult ADHD quality of life assessment. This is an adult executive function assessment. So we're going to compare outcomes at 3 different data collection points: pre-test, post-test, and follow-up. And we're going to do that between a CBT only group and then a CBT plus executive function training via a CCT group, henceforth to be known as CBT EF, which is another acronym, but I'm just so sorry. I'm not going to say that every time. So basically, participants will be adults with ADHD. What this study hopes to find, hopefully, this study finds that the CBT EF group will obtain higher scores on the AAQOL, which means improved quality of life, and lower scores on the Brief A, which means improved executive function, in comparison to the CBT group. or the CBT only group. So, and it also hopes to find that decreases in brief A scores are correlated with increases in AAQOL scores across both groups. I don't know if correlated or resultant would be a better word there, but that's the word I used. So what would this mean for us counselors? This is the last slide. Thanks for bearing with me. First, it would mean that there is support for the existing literature that has documented worse executive function as a predictor of worse quality of life, as well as illustrate the impact that executive function deficits have on the functioning of adults with ADHD. This would imply the importance of monitoring and screening for executive function, given its effect on the lives of clients with ADHD. And this implication may even extend beyond the ADHD population. Additionally, it may be prudent for counselors working with adult ADHD clients to better understand executive function training, and the associated costs and benefits of pursuing that. That means cost of the programs, the risk of it not working, the time you're taking away from more evidence-based treatment. This would also entail taking informed consent for the specific intervention of executive function training because it's a whole new modality. So you obviously should amend your informed consent to reflect the treatment that you plan to administer. I think that's everything. If I talk too fast, great.